Up next on All About the Gear, a special guest and I talk about the exciting brand new Leica Q. Hello, it's Doug K, and we're here with another episode of All About the Gear, but we've got a change. Instead of my new partner in crime, Gordon Lang, who's on vacation traveling around the continent of Europe, we've got my old partner in crime, Mr. Frederick Van Johnson. Frederick, how are you?
I'm good, Doug. It feels good to be back on the show. It kind of feels like, like when you go visit your old high school and you're like, yeah, I remember that locker. It kind of feels like that. It feels good. It feels good to be back on the show. And I'm excited to talk about the Leica Q, which is what we're going to dive into, right?
That's it.
So first of all, I think you have a confession to make because you have a substance abuse problem, and that substance happens to be cameras, right? So you keep buying these cameras, and you purchased the Leica Q for yourself, right?
I did. So let's start out this show by admitting that I'm a fanboy and take that into consideration. But the fact is that I thought I had cured my gear acquisition syndrome, and I like to believe that once again I finally have. And I'll tell you the whole story. But my personal photography style has gone in the last few years almost exclusively to doing street photography.
Hmm.
And so I've been on the lookout for the perfect street camera. I've used Leica film cameras for a few months. I've been using Sony cameras with Leica lenses. I've tried, Fuji X100s, all sorts of different things. Never been quite happy. But when the specs for the Leica Q first came out in June, I said, oh, that looks really interesting. I knew it'd be hard to get. So I put an order in with B&H. And it just sat there. I made the mistake, however, of going to the San Francisco Leica store with my credit card.
Never
Don't
do
do
that.
that. Do not do that. Do not go to a Leica store and ask to look at the queue with a credit card. Leave your credit card at home.
And the San Francisco Leica store is beautiful. So, I mean, there's no way you would leave there without something in your hands.
It's a very dangerous place. Anyway,
Yeah.
so yes. So with the caveat that I do own the camera, and yes, I do love it, and hopefully it's the last camera I will ever buy. Not.
Yeah, come on. Yeah, right. And the sun will not come up tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about the basics of this thing. What's the sensor size? And is this a, thanks for putting it on the screen. So this is a fixed lens, right? This is not interchangeable lens. So give me the basics.
Yeah, this is an unusual camera for Leica, but it's really designed for the classic street photography market, if there is such a thing. 24 megapixels. It's a non-interchangeable lens camera, so it has a 28 millimeter fixed lens,
Hmm.
24 megapixels, as you said. It's an f1.7 Summilux lens. It's not the same as what we call the Summilux line in the M mount lenses, and we'll talk about that. It's pricey. It's $4,250,
Oh,
4250 US with this package. However, that's about the last dollars you'll ever spend on it because you can't go out and buy another lens for it. You can't get rid of this thing.
yeah.
It is unusual for a serious Leica camera in that has autofocus. We'll talk about that quite a bit. Very hard to get. It turns out that the easiest way to get it is to actually go to a Leica store. If you order from Amazon, B&H, as of a few days ago, they were not even shipping this camera, and I've had this for 2 or 3 weeks. So
Wow.
at the moment, depending on when you see this, it's a little hard to get.
And then we're going to dive into this. But first of all, 4250. Okay, like 4250 by any stretch is a lot of money for a camera, considering all the alternatives that are out there, right? So, of course, I understand Leica quality. Leica's awesome. We did one of the first shows we did was called Leica or Leave 'em, right? We kind of talked about what are the benefits of Leica and that Leica look, but boiling it down to you want to be a street photographer. 4250 out of pocket, is it worth it versus going to buy a Sony A7, one of the A7s, or one of the Panasonics or Fujis for $3,000 less in many cases?
Yeah, but take a look at what's out there. The brand new A7R Mark II is well over $3,000, and that's just for the body. You add a lens, you're going to get up, good lens, you're going to get up to the same price as this puppy. The A7, sorry, the RX1R from Sony, the RX1R, which up until now has been sort of one of the higher end non-interchangeable street cameras. That's $2,800 with the lens. That's only a third less than this, and it's a few years old already. So yes, this is pricey. Yes, it's at the high end, but it's also, it's somewhere around 1/3 of the price of buying a regular Leica digital. So if you buy an M240 and you get a good lens or a couple of lenses, you're going to be spending 3 times as much as this camera.
Yeah, and I want to get into the body and controls and the feel of this camera, because a lot of it is quality, right? Because when you did that film show, you were talking about how you got a Leica film camera that was old, right? And just hit the ground running with it. It was flawless and just worked. So part of that fee, that 4250, tax, is for quality and probably resale value as well, right? So when you down the line, when you want to get rid of this thing, you'll probably recoup much of that 4250, right?
Yeah, not like as much in the film cameras, because the film cameras just didn't change over the years. Digital, of course, as they change processors and things like that, you're not going to have the resale value hold up quite as well, because this camera will be improved over time, and then there'll be a rush to get the new one. But yeah, I mean, we've got to get past the cost issue, because it is pricey, and there are not a lot of people out there who are going to spend that kind of money. Yeah. So I take that appropriately, let's say.
Yeah, of course. And it's not to say that you're not going to make great images if you don't buy this camera. You could buy other cameras for cheaper and still make great images. Don't use the fact that you can't afford 4250 and Leica Q as an excuse not to go out and shoot. Doug wants this camera because he wants his camera.
Yeah, on the other hand, I'm finally selling the end of my my Nikon gear, and I will more than make up for this, because I have a D3S I'm selling and about 8 lenses. So
you're liquidating. Awesome.
I am liquidating Nikon. God, it's hard. It's really hard, but I'm going to sell that last Nikon body. Once I sell the body, I can't use the lenses, so they'll go. So I just have to, I have to pull the plug and get rid of it.
But you could use well, you can't use them on this body, obviously, but on your Sonys, you could use Nikon glass with an adapter, right?
Yeah, but the new Sony lenses are so good and so much better with autofocus that I don't.
Yeah,
I've also stocked on the Sony gear.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about this camera. So body and controls and just the overall ergonomics of it. When you had it on the screen there, it looks like, when I look at Leica cameras, it's like a Porsche or a BMW, right? They all look very similar, and you can tell instantly from that form factor that it's a Leica. What's different about this one?
Yeah, this is, Leica's done a lot of stuff with Panasonic over the last few years. And a lot of the cameras are manufactured by Panasonic, or Panasonic had a lot to do with it. This one is pure Leica, designed and manufactured in Germany. They've certainly had a lot of input from Panasonic, Lumix, regarding features, but they have taken this camera back to the bare minimums. It has, again, for street photography, the absolute best controls I have ever had on a camera. It has a real shutter speed dial. It has a real aperture ring. It has a manual focus ring. But catch this. If you take the manual focus, let me show it to you there, and you keep moving it over, and you push this little button on the bottom, you can't quite see there, it goes to AF. So you get into autofocus simply by turning the focus ring to the extreme.
So good. Okay?
And so here's this little button on the bottom, really hard to see in the video, but it's right there where your finger can just touch it very, very easily. So,
brilliant.
So basically you have full control over all the things, and there's an A position for everything. So you've got a shutter speed dial. This is like Fuji. These are Fuji controls on steroids. You move it to A. Now you have automatic shutter. Aperture, you have an aperture control. You move it past 1.7 and it goes to A. Now you're in that. So if you put everything in A, you're in program mode. And then this wheel here is used to select the options within program mode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The camera does macro. Check this out. Hope this shows up. So if I take this ring down here and I rotate it into macro mode, if I can do that, watch the focus scale.
Oh, look at that!
Right. So it just changes the focus scale. Boy, it's a little hard to see, but
I can see
it just
it.
changes the focus scale from normal to macro. And with macro, it basically cuts down the close focus distance by half. So Leica lenses typically focus down at about 0.7 of a meter, and this takes it down to about 1/3 of a meter for close focusing. Has real depth of field scale, right there on the lens.
Well,
again, for people who want to do zone focusing or hyperfocal stuff, that's great. It's got, man, I just love this thing. It has the best electronic viewfinder of any camera I have ever used.
Really? Why?
Well, first of all, let me look at the specs here. It's 3.68 megapixels. It's bright. It's fast. It's sharp. It's just a gorgeous viewfinder. It has a rear LCD. In Leica style, it has very minimalist menus, but everything you need is there. But it's so much simpler than, let's say, those awful Sony menus. But everything you need is right there. It is a touch.
Is that LCD touch, or is it?
It is a touch screen.
Okay, good.
Right. So, for example, if I go into, let me pick the right mode here. If I go into, for example, exposure compensation, I can sit here like this. Does this show up? Well, sort of does. Yep. And I can sit there and that didn't work. It's hard to do this on television, of course, here. But I can move the exposure compensation, in theory, there we go, just by moving this little slider.
Okay,
right?
Cool, yeah.
So it's got that. You can use the touch for focusing. You can use the touch for focus and shoot. It does not tilt. That's one of the things I miss about the camera. It doesn't tilt or articulate, but it's a very nice display. Controls on the back, as you see, are minimal. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 buttons on the left. There's a little thumb wheel thing. A new thing is this little, very interesting. Notice that this little thing is a little indented thumb rest, right? So it actually fits in just the right place to hold this camera, as you can sort of see here, right? It's a little indented little thingy.
Somebody was thinking. Somebody was thinking. Yeah. What about how do you get, so exposure compensation, I saw it on the touchscreen. What if you want to get to it manually? Is there a way
then you've got this wheel up here, which if you just do this, very smart, which is if you turn the wheel one click, I've got it set. We left some in there. Let's go back here. If you turn the wheel one click, it turns on the exposure compensation dial. And then as you rotate it left or right, it adjusts the compensation. Okay. I love that little feature that turning it just activates that display. And of course you can see it in the viewfinder as well.
Wow.
Now,
love it.
This little button here is magic. This is something very unique to this camera.
I can't see it. Where is it? Which button?
Okay. Yeah. This little guy right there.
Okay. Got it.
Hard to see, right? But the camera, as we said, has a 28mm lens. However, if I press this once, I get a 35mm crop window. If I press it again, I get a 50mm crop window. And if I press it a third time, it goes back to 28. So what's actually happening here? What it's doing is it's showing you the crop lines that you would get for these different focal lengths. Again, it's not changing the focal length of the lens. It's just cropping. And in the JPEGs, as well as in the preview that you'll see on the back of the camera, it's actually doing it. So if I go to 35mm, the area within that rectangle is what's going to show up in the JPEG. It'll show up in the RAW file by default. And that's when I play back an image, that's what I'll see is just that area in the rectangle. And that's a really nice feature.
Wow. But yeah, from just hearing you describe it, it looks like they really sat down and thought about little details, like just that little divot in there where your thumb rests.
Yeah,
I can see a prototype coming through and some, product manager or designer saying, you know what, wouldn't it be great if we just did this little bit? Who cares how much it costs? And those little fit and finish things are what separate like luxury vehicles from non-luxury vehicles, right?
Yeah, they've got a new designer that they hired. They used to use an outside firm for a lot of the design. They've got this whiz kid. So he's in his 20s. I can't remember his name. And they hired him. This camera's been in the works for a year and a half. And he did this whole industrial design job on this camera from start to finish, and
Nice.
just did it brilliantly. I'll show you this. I bought the add-on. Let me see if I can show it to you here. The add-on grip,
Okay.
which goes into the tripod socket, as you would guess.
Is that
And
just for ergonomics, or does
yeah,
that do anything other?
purely for ergonomics.
Uh-huh.
Right? Screw that into the tripod socket if I can do it right, and then I get a little bit of a grip here. You see this? You see this
Oh, I
grip?
like that. Yeah.
Right. So now I have a finger grip that I can use, and it works in combination with the little thumb divot there.
Does it, when you put that on there, does it inhibit access to changing batteries or SD cards?
It does. It does. You have to remove it for that.
Okay.
There's no door opening
There's no
underneath.
panel. Okay.
No.
All right.
Some people have criticized the fact that the SD card's in the bottom. Why isn't it on the side? But the side does have HDMI and USB. We'll talk
Okay.
about the HDMI shortly. But
Okay.
that little grip is not. Now it's not a light camera. It's a fairly heavy camera. If I got anything around here to show you size wise, compare it, for example, to my little teeny Sony RX100, which, all right, that's not a fair comparison, but it's what I happen to have on the desk. You can see that it's a good size. So it's not small, it's not lightweight, it's not pocketable, but it feels real good to shoot with.
All right, Doug. So here's a question. So looking at this camera, from the top down view, what you were saying at the top of the show was you said, quote, it's a terrific street camera, one of the best street cameras you've ever used. Is that because of image quality, because of ergonomics, including where the dials are positioned, the menuing system? What makes this the best street camera? And you've tried, as evidenced by this week in photo, all about the gear, many cameras. So that's a strong statement. Why is this the best?
Yeah, it's really all of the above, all those things that you mentioned. The first is probably the simplicity, because the last thing you want to do when you're out on the street is be distracted by your gear. And I'm especially because when I do reviews, I'm very distracted by the gear. This one I took to just immediately. It's very simple. I tend to go out and use this in fully automatic mode to start. So I throw it into automatic aperture, automatic shutter, autofocus, and auto ISO. And it's going to take great pictures just like that. Now, if I come across a scene where I need some exposure compensation, I have to take it out of full auto. I have to select an aperture or a shutter speed, but then I have exposure compensation. If I want depth of field, I just dial it down to f5.6, f8. If I want a specific shutter speed, I dial that in. But then I almost always go back to full automatic. If I want manual focus, I just move the focus ring and I focus. The focus peaking is the best I've ever seen. Some of the focus peaking that you get out of other cameras is too generous. It'll show you things that are in focus that aren't really in focus.
I've noticed that. Yeah.
Yeah, Sony in particular is way too generous. You say, "Oh man, I nailed the focus," and you get home and it's soft.
Right.
Not so in this. This is a much more critical focus peaking. So everything's right there. And again, when you see something, you walk around in full automatic mode. When you see something that requires an override, you just do the override and go back to automatic. So for a street photographer, it's really nice.
What's the response time like the startup time, or when you're waking it up, like you see something on the street that you want to shoot, the time from pulling it off of your hip to composing and the camera's ready to go? Is it fast? Is it slow? What do you think?
Yeah, if you power it up from dead, it comes up pretty fast, less than a second. Unfortunately, if it goes to sleep, it takes about the same amount of time to come back to life. And what you do is you develop the habit of, as you're walking around and you see something, the very first thing you do is you tap the shutter release button. And of course, that wakes up the camera so that by the time it gets up to your eye and you're ready, you've got it. But you do have that slight delay, but you develop the habits to deal with it. Battery life, interesting. Again, the Panasonic Lumix linkage, they use the same battery that they use in some of the Lumix cameras. And the battery life seems to be pretty good. I can get maybe 300 plus shots on a battery from a day of street shooting.
That's good. And the batteries are probably relatively small, so you can have a couple of batteries with you, right?
Yeah, and if you don't buy the Leica branded batteries, you can actually afford them.
That are made of gold,
That's
right?
right.
And unicorn tears.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so what about the other just sort of ergonomic question is weather sealing on a camera like this? Obviously, people are gonna like this. Leica always struck me as like the photojournalist's camera that you're gonna see in Southeast Asia, running around and taking awesome shots. Real photojournalists are gonna use this camera. Is it gonna stand up to that?
Well, this is not a weather sealed camera, and Leica is very clear about that. But when it comes to street photography, we don't go out in bad weather. If it's too cold, we stay home. If it starts to rain, we drop into a Starbucks or a coffee shop. So it's just fine for that. I have not used it in any moisture whatsoever, but it's explicitly not weather sealed.
Okay. All right. Understood. All right. Let's dive into the back of the camera. So you mentioned that EVF and the LCD. Go into a little more depth on that. So, what you said it's the best that you've used. And again, sprinkling some of that grain of salt fanboyism on there. So, guilty. So why is it the best? Because it doesn't have a touch. Well, it has touch, but no tilt. So,
Yeah,
but it's still the best.
Yeah, the EVF, the electronic viewfinder, is the best I've ever used on a digital camera. Not so for the LCD. The LCD is fine. It's good enough. From a usability point of view, I wish it tilted so that I could get shots from down low without lying on the ground, or up from overhead without a ladder.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll forgive it that. The LCD is perfectly adequate for use in menus, which luckily you rarely have to go into the menus with this, but also for the little bit of touch. Again, in just a few weeks of using this camera, I'm not using the touch so much. I reposition my focus point using the thumb wheel on the back, the tilting dial.
Mm-hmm.
The rear for me is just when I want to do an image review or something like that. But the EVF, the electronic viewfinder, is very bright. I can't quite see the full 28 millimeter frame, even without glasses. It's just literally on the limit. When you get right up against it, you have to slightly move your head to see the very far edges of the frame. But it doesn't bother me. I'm used to that with so many digital cameras anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting. You see, because you're a photographer that you like to bring it up and use that EVF, close to your face. I'm seeing a split now. It's interesting. There's some photographers that swear by that, and then there are other photographers like myself that I prefer using the big LCD on the back of the camera to do my composing and shooting, and sometimes even tap to focus. And I use the LCD a lot more than most people. Are you seeing that kind of split?
Yeah, I think so. And the big difference is because you don't know yet, and that's you're not wearing bifocals. Just give it time, right? Because
they'll be holding the camera out like
it's the this kind of look, right? This is the bifocal giveaway, right? But I've come the other way too. I've gotten much better about using the LCD for certain shots. If I want to get down low, I'll hold this down somewhat low, even though I'm not, perpendicular to that LCD. I can still see it and I can compose a shot. So I'm using it more and more, especially when I have the tilt, of course, but this doesn't quite have that. So again, beautiful EVF, not particularly noteworthy rear LCD, but it does the job. During playback, it's sort of nice because you also have this pinch and pan, so you can zoom into the image just by, doing this or this.
Mm-hmm.
Works very nicely. One interesting thing is that when you do play back an image, you put it into playback mode, and at first the image just looks awful, and then sort of like you basically get the thing to focus. It takes about a second, and then the JPEG gives you the full focus. It sort of snaps into focus.
Interesting.
So another weird thing about this is there's a JPEG mode and a RAW plus JPEG, but there is no RAW only mode. You can't get RAW files without also having JPEGs.
Interesting.
I think that's because they need the JPEGs to play back on the camera, but I'm not sure. I've developed a system for getting rid of the JPEGs in Lightroom, but it's a little bit of a manual process. That's something to get used to. Also, the RAW files are gigantic. The RAW files out of the camera, even though it's only 24 megapixel, these are 42 megabyte raw files, which means they're up there like the D810 or almost at the Canon 5DS size.
Yeah.
But
So do they bear that out in a side by side comparison with with a
yeah,
Nikon?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, they're huge. And what's interesting is I go into Lightroom, and if I take the raw files, they use DNG as the normal raw file format. But if I take the DNG files and simply export them to another DNG without compression, so I'm basically just copying the file, they shrink by 50%. So again, I have part of my import process is to take all the raw files and just make copies of them, and they shrink by half.
Yeah, smart. Smart. That's interesting. Wow. Okay, so tell me about the shutter in there. So, again, street photography from a street photographer standpoint, the shutter and shutter speed and electronic shutter for silence is important. How does this camera stack up?
Well, the mechanical shutter is a leaf shutter, and we'll see if we can hear it here. Probably can't hear that. It's super quiet. It's like any leaf shutter. It's it's such a small little thing.
Mm-hmm.
The leaf shutter, mechanical shutter, goes up to about a 2,000th of a second, and then this is programmable, but it'll go up to 16 thousandths of a second, 16000, 1/16,000th of a second in electronic shutter mode. Now, from a point of view of street photography, that means I can go out there and I can shoot in bright sunlight at f1.7. I don't need a neutral density filter. I don't have to worry about there being too much light. So that's a real nice feature.
Wow. I remember when 1/8,000th of a second was like the benchmark. Now this thing has doubled that.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. You remember those days, right? Nikon and Canon were like, yeah, up to 1/8,000th of a second,
That's right. And that's pretty much the state of the art for most digital cameras these days.
Yep. So the other benchmark is ISO sensitivity. And I know with your Sonys, do you have an A7S?
I do.
Yeah. So you're spoiled with that see in the dark magical A7S. How does this compare to that in terms of ISO?
Yeah, it's not quite as fast. That thing goes up to 409,600, and it's usable up to about 25 or even 50,000. This is a 1 or 2 stops less. I'm very comfortable. I have it set to go up to ISO 32,000 in my auto ISO.
Mm-hmm.
And as is happening with so many cameras these days, when they do get noisy, the noise is not objectionable. It's something that can be cleaned up in something like Lightroom. But again, I shoot at night with this. I shoot dark interiors. My photography tends to be a little dark on the dark side anyway, so it's not a problem. But just, not a problem. ISO is just not an issue with this camera, unless for some reason you needed small apertures like f8, f11 in the dark. That would be problematic, but that's probably true on almost any camera.
Yeah. It sounds like, it has a lot more to give than you'll probably take at any given point.
Yeah.
It's a highly capable camera.
And
any other thoughts on the sensor in that?
Well, the sensor is interesting. There's a lot of speculation around who made it. And Leica's not saying. In an interview with the designers, they were saying, is it a Sony sensor? No. Is it a Panasonic sensor or an Olympus sensor? No. And then somebody mentioned, what was it? It was Samsung. And at that point in the interview, the Leica guys just clammed up.
So
there is
selling silence.
Yeah. So there is some. I'm looking at my notes here, making sure I got that right. I think I got it right. It is suspicious that they went in that direction and that they might be using something like a Samsung chip. And from reviewing one of the Samsung cameras, that was terrific image quality, and there is a little bit of similarity in there. I can see where that might be the case.
From a just a consumer / all I care about is the images photographer standpoint, does it matter like where the sensor comes from? If the image quality is amazing and the ergonomics of the camera, like why do we care about the camera's internal DNA if it's doing the job?
That's of course the right question. If you get the quality you want, then who cares? But it does tell us something about where the future of all this might be going. If they've got a new partnership. And, I think we did the show together. We did the NX1 from Samsung.
Yeah.
And that was a shock how good the quality from that camera was. I love the image quality.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing some of that in this. This image quality is superb. The f1.7 Summilux lens is gorgeous. The color, the contrast, the sharpness are just spectacular. It's just what you'd expect from Leica. Now, this brings up an interesting thing, which is that this camera has a processor, and that processor is not only adjusting the JPEG files and doing lens correction, but it's also doing that for RAW files. And you cannot undo that. You cannot get to a RAW file. So let me explain. Every lens has a certain amount of distortion. With a 28 millimeter wide angle, that's going to be especially true. Every lens is going to have a certain amount of vignetting where it gets a little darker in the corners. And that's what lens profiles in Lightroom do. That's what JPEGs are done in camera. In this case, Leica is applying a lens correction, not just to the JPEG, but to the RAW file as well. So when you bring it into Lightroom or whatever your application is, there is no profile to be applied. It's already been pre-applied and you cannot undo it.
Interesting. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
That's a huge debate out there. There are some people who say, how could you possibly do that? And they said, well, if we showed you the RAW file that comes out of this lens, you wouldn't like it because it's there's a fair amount of vignetting, perhaps. There's a fair amount of distortion. But by leveraging the processors, they're able to make lenses that are smaller, lighter, and less expensive and still give you spectacular results. So the purists will say, no. You've got to it's all got to be in the glass, right? You've got to make better glass. But the more pragmatic people, and I'm one of them, says, I only care about the image quality. If it's a combination of lens and processor, I really don't care as long as I get a beautiful image. And that's what they've done here. So they've combined, this is a trend. We see this in Micro Four Thirds in particular, very common for the lens profiles to be built into the lenses and come through. So it's the wave of the future. It's here. The future is here.
It's just technology, right? I mean, in that it's not only pervasive in this industry. If you think about like aeronautics, right? I mean, fly-by-wire systems that buffer the pilot from all the crazy wind turbulence and give the pilot a much smoother experience when flying, deceptively so, because of all the electronics that are between the outside world and the pilot. Same thing with this, right? You have a lens that's gathering all of this information and correcting before it gets to you, in the final image. But that's a debate that will go on forever because it's like, why do you're on the one hand, your camera's manipulating your image. That's not fair. I want the real bits, and on the other hand, the image would look like crap if you got it straight out of the camera with no manipulation. So
yeah, and you mentioned fly-by-wire, and I want to bring up one other topic here, which is really important. This lens, for example, has an aperture ring, which a lot of photographers, including me, love, and that is you can dial in any aperture. Yeah. So what's really happening there? This is, even though it's got one third stop clicks, this is aperture by wire. The same is true for the shutter speed dial. The same is true, not for focus actually, actually it is for focus. And we'll talk about that. But in this case, the reason it is because you can just move it to the A position. Now, another thing that's important about this is, let's say I'm shooting at f8. And I want to manually focus this camera. Well, at at f8 with a 28 millimeter lens, basically everything's going to be in focus. So it's look like it's in focus. So it's very hard. So what this camera does is very similar to a DSLR. And that is that while I'm composing the shot, I'm actually looking at this thing wide open. Even if I dial F11 or F16, I'm actually seeing the image in the viewfinder wide open. It's not actually stopping down the lens until I press the shutter release. That's the point, just like with a DSLR, that the iris in the lens actually stops down to that aperture. That means I can manually focus much more critically. It also means that there's a lot more light for viewing and for autofocus. Okay.
Yeah.
but yet it feels entirely like these are mechanical controls. It feels that way, but they're not. And that's
Yeah,
something that I
it's
think is important
designed.
to know.
Yeah, that's part of that UX, right? The user experience that the designers have created to make us humans feel good about ourselves, right? So
That's right.
yeah.
And
So
again, they've done a beautiful job.
with that fly-by-wire system in there, I mean, I don't know. I mean, where do you fall on it? So you said you're okay with it, and you like the technology between the actual image and you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, in this case, I want the lens to be wide open while I compose the shot and focus.
Yeah.
If I press the shutter release halfway down, then it shows me the actual depth of field by
Hmm.
stopping down the lens to the setting that I've got.
Yeah.
And so I can see depth of field. I can see all the other aspects of
You
it as
see all
well.
your settings before you complete the press and
Yeah,
record the image. Yeah.
yeah. And so that's really nice. And again, the viewfinder is so sharp that I can actually do a pretty good job of seeing what's in focus, depth of field wise, and so forth. And
Yeah.
and again, in terms of how am I for this melding of processors and lenses, I think it's great because otherwise, this camera would be a lot more expensive if it had to have all the optics done in glass like a
Hmm.
film camera does. Those lenses are a lot more expensive.
Yeah. In other words, I for one welcome my Leica overlords. Right? Come on.
I mean, this is a disruptive camera from a Leica's perspective. You know, if you're going to only spend $1,000 on a camera, this isn't your camera. But in Leica land, you know, if they had an interchangeable lens version of this, it would kill their main product line.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we skipped over video a little bit. So with this camera, am I getting 4K for my 4K?
Not yet, but
Not
it's
yet.
interesting. It's 1080p. It'll go 60 frames a second. There's no external mic or headphone jack. It's got two little stereo mics on the top. But of course, nowadays people tend to shoot double system anyway for anything serious where you record your audio separately and match those up. But
Yep.
again, in this interview with the people who designed the camera, they said, you know, it's really all set to do 4K video, showing their relationship to Panasonic Lumix there. The only problem is heat. They can't at this point do 4K video without it overheating. So whether that's a firmware fix or a later new version of the hardware, which I think is more likely, it has the potential for doing 4K video down the road.
Yeah. Yeah. All the bits are there. They just need to sew them together. What about the connectivity, the wireless connectivity of this thing?
It's really good. You know, we've gotten used to the standard thing. There's a mobile app that will both control the camera and do playback. I was just using it yesterday for reviewing my images, and it's very fast, very responsive. Has NFC. I believe I don't have NFC because I'm an Apple user, but it will do a great job of, you know, controlling the camera and letting you review the images, which is all you really need.
That's it. Yeah. As long as it works, and it works every time. That's the key for these apps that I say, you know, it's gotta be easy to get into and work consistently in order for you to use it. Otherwise you just would never use it. Just
Yeah,
like
I would say this is one of the least finicky apps I've used. It seems to, you know, it starts up, it works, it doesn't stop on you halfway through, that kind of stuff. It seems quite reliable.
Very cool. So what do you see in the future? Put on your looking glass future hat. Tell me, what do you think's coming up for this thing?
Yeah, I think one of the things they've said, and they've been surprisingly frank about this in discussions about this whole camera, which is surprising. But when I first got it, I was saying, boy, I wish it had a 35 millimeter instead of a 28. I've gotten used to using the crop, but you know, when you crop to 35, you still have the distortion of a 28. You still have that, you know, the depth of a 28. So they've said, though, that if there's enough demand for it, they will consider making a 35 version and a 50 millimeter version, which makes it, you know, quite similar to who does that? It's the Sigma Quattro has, you know, a 28, a 35, and a 50 in the non-interchangeable lens. So that's a possibility there. They've already talked about firmware updates, things that they want to improve in firmware. So that's going to be coming. Some people have asked for phase detect autofocus. Disappointed that this is just contrast only, but I'll tell you, in single shot mode, this autofocus is excellent. It is fast. It is super, super accurate, nails the focus every time. I use it in spot focus mode. I may move the spot around, but I just have one focus spot. It is not a great camera for continuous autofocus. So people running towards you away, you get the hunting, you get shots that are off and so forth.
Yeah.
So phase detect autofocus on the sensor could be coming. And the buttons, there are a couple of things. You can reprogram one of the buttons, but you have limited choices about what it can do. Again, firmware upgrade. Could they add one more button that would be programmable? That might be nice. That's the kind of thing I see in future versions of the camera.
These sound like minor issues, in terms of your overall enjoyment of the camera. Bottom line, top line is that you love this camera and it's doing the job for you, right? This is your go-to camera right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I shot 450 images on the streets of San Francisco. Virtually, almost everything was in focus. Everything was beautifully exposed, great color, very sharp. The only problems were with the photographer. So, I've got nothing to complain. This is a camera that I can't come home with and say, damn you, camera, you'd let me down. This camera doesn't do it. And it is, again, even after just a few weeks, as you say, it's become the go-to camera, and it's one that just feels right for me. It just feels real good.
Well, does this mean, so you mentioned you're selling your Nikon. Does your Nikon gear, does this mean you're also going to be ditching that Sony gear?
No, because I still, I just had a couple of portrait gigs I had to do, and I don't think a 28 millimeter is a particularly flattering lens for portraits. I've got to shoot a wedding in August. I wouldn't shoot a wedding with a 28 millimeter.
Right.
So don't tell anybody I'm shooting a wedding. I don't want that to get out.
Okay. Just between us and the thousands.
Just between us and 10,000 or 20,000 of our closest friends.
Yeah.
So, no, I still love the Sony, the A7S. I'm going to Cuba, for example. I'll take this on my Cuba workshops, but I'll probably also take that A7S and, heaven forbid, a zoom lens as well.
Heresy.
I know.
A zoom lens for a street photographer? That's illegal. Come on.
I know. But you got to be prepared for everything.
You got to be prepared. Yeah. Well, what about the competition? Who's out there that's, if someone's looking at this and they're like, yeah, $4,200, that's quite a chunk of change, and I got a kid to put through college, maybe I'll look at something cheaper. What should they be looking at?
Yeah, take up stamp collecting or something. Luckily,
or sketching, right?
Yeah. Go into charcoal drawing as a profession, right? So this is fairly easy because I think the obvious comparison is to other cameras that have fixed, non-interchangeable prime lenses, and there are two to note. The most obvious is the Fuji X100 series. Now the top of that line is the Fuji X100T. Mm-hmm. That is the version of this camera, if you will, for people with reasonable budgets. It is a superb camera. It's a slightly smaller sensor, APS-C. It's less than 1/3 the cost of this camera. It has the equivalent of a 35 millimeter lens, so it's a little narrower field, but I think that's maybe better for most people. It's excellent in every way. Great controls, image quality, features, autofocus. It's smaller and lighter than this camera. If you use both, I think most people would prefer this camera, but in terms of bang for the buck, the X100T is virtually impossible to beat out there. So, that's the go-to camera in this category. The other one is the Sony RX1R, which is already a few years old. Like this, it's 24 megapixels. It's full frame like this. It's about 1/3 less the cost, has a great lens, has the awful Sony menu system, has no electronic viewfinder. You can buy an add-on viewfinder for it, but it's really a back of the camera LCD thing. I love the camera. We reviewed it together. It was great at the time, but I can't recommend this camera now. It's too expensive for what it does compared to the Fuji. The only thing is that we were expecting to see a new one soon. The gossip is it's going to have a curved sensor, which will be a first, and we'll see where that is. But right now, I think the Fuji X100T is the Leica Q for everyman.
Got it. So yeah, so there you have it. Those are your two choices. If you can swing it, get the Leica Q. If you can't swing it, then there's still the X100T out there, which you can't go wrong probably with either, right? But yeah,
Well, you can go poor with the Leica.
poor with great images, right? But you'll get great images.
If you've been doing this long enough and you have a bunch of stuff you can sell and generate enough revenue, then you can justify this, with your spouse.
Yes.
That's how I did it. In fact, in my dining room right now is covered with Nikon glass, so that I can say, see, this is what I'm selling to pay for the Leica. It hasn't been sold yet, but
yes, it's all about perception. Then you can slowly put it back in the cabinet later. Cool, Doug. So this is great, man. This is a good overview of the Leica Q. What's coming up next on All About the Gear?
Well, the next show we've got is the Sony RX100 Mark IV. How many cameras do we know have been through 4 generations before changing their basic model number? This will be one of the first. Looking forward to that. It actually arrives today from borrowlenses.com. Thank you, Borrow Lenses. And we'll be putting it through its paces and doing that review coming up soon. And then, of course, one of the things down the road we've got to look at is the Sony A7R Mark II. This is the camera that everybody's talking about as possibly camera of the year, because it is that 42 megapixel camera with in-body image stabilization, solving hopefully all of the weaknesses of the original A7R. So
yeah, including, if I'm not mistaken, 4K recording of video to the card. Does this one do that?
I believe so. So. And we haven't got our hands on it. I think Gordon will be back by the time that's available to us, and that'll be coming up. But you and I are going to do the RX100 Mark IV show.
Yes, and we're also, I think, in the future going to be doing one on the DxO1 iPhone camera, right?
Yeah, and I have no idea what that is. So you've shown me the box, so I'm interested to see what that is.
I have some thoughts. Yeah, we'll have a nice discussion about that one.
All right.
Cool, man. All right. Well, thanks, Doug.
Thank you. I'll do the goodbye. Frederick, it's been another great episode of All About the Gear. Thanks to you and for filling in for Gordon once again. And I look forward to the next one.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Doug.
Bye-bye.